This presentation seeks to explore why the popularity of special economic zones as a vehicle for development in the global south, particularly in Africa, and we are looking at the example of the Musina-Makhado Special Economic Zone, which is proposed for the Limpopo province in South Africa. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Hazel Sharenda at the University of Venda for her environmental science inputs, and to Mishak Mabangula of Makua for his insights and expertise on community public participation processes, and for organizing community focus groups, as well as our survey research in Musina-Makhado. We would also like to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for the funding that made this possible and for facilitating the fieldwork around the public participation process. The presentation will take two angles. The first is that we will look at special economic zones against the broader backdrop of the global political economy and reconfigurations of economic power within the global sphere. The presentation then turns to the environmental impact assessment process as a form of public participation, greenwashing, and justification for the zone. Finally, we turn to the question of whether the SEZ Mega Project may go ahead despite the detrimental environmental and livelihoods impacts, as well as the public participation process and inputs phase that is currently still underway. We'd like to mention in particular that we are not examining the environmental impact assessment in a great deal of detail, except to refer to the water scarcity aspects and to the aspects around energy which may affect the broader communities and that may have repercussions for the communities in and around Musina-Makhado over the medium term. Objections to the environmental impact assessment can be found online, particularly on the Centre for Environmental Rights site as well as EarthLife. We will thus focus on the public participation process in detail, as well as the degree of information that communities have within the Musina-Makhado area on the zone. China's phenomenal growth over the last 3 decades is seen largely as due to special economic zones, such as the Shenzhen zone that kick-started China's trade diversification from 1980 into the early 2000s. It's as a result of this that organizations like the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Industry have endorsed special economic zones as a fairly fail-safe way of attracting large-scale foreign and local investment into countries who need to diversify their economic bases, especially economies in Africa that are primarily commodity-driven or primary product-based. Greater trade value can be added, according to the official blurb, to natural resources through industrialization and manufacturing diversification. This is what we call the creation of value chains, and this is seen as particularly important to development in the global south. Special economic zones have also been promoted through 2 large-scale global south blocks. The first is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, or BRICS bloc, and the second is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC. In Africa, the Central Cooperation Platform for Chinese-led development initiatives is FOCAC. Facts released by the Chinese Ministry on Foreign Affairs in November this year to commemorate 20 years of FOCAC show just how massive Chinese investment and infrastructural support has been over the last 2 decades. In 2019, trade between China and Africa hit the US $208 billion mark, and the total Chinese FDI in Africa reached $49.1 billion US. This is a 20-fold and 100-fold growth trajectory, respectively, compared with 20 years ago. Dozens of economic and trade cooperation zones and industrial parks have been set up across Africa. China has built over 6,000 kilometers of railways, the same mileage of roads, nearly 20 ports, over 80 large-scale power plants or mega projects, and more than 130 medical facilities, 45 stadiums, and 170 or so schools. These projects all form part of China's Aid and Development Project. These initiatives are largely through FOCAC, which works in tandem with the African Union, and projects like the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway and Maputo-Katemba Bridge are seen as part of the effort towards helping Africa achieve its century dream. Officials refer to them as symbols of the shared development of China and Africa. As mentioned, one example is the Mombasa-Nairobi railway line, which was built at considerable expense to the Kenyan fiscus over the last while. While the project has been promoted as a success story, it has also tipped the Kenyan financial situation into a higher ratio of debt to GDP than ever before. So Kenya's current debt to GDP ratio, like South Africa's, has now extended beyond the safe zone of approximately 70% of debt to GDP into the 70 and 80% realms in relation to current GDP levels, and this will of course be aggravated by COVID-19. China's aid to Africa is known as going out or Dianzu. This strategy aims to reconfigure the global epicenter of world trade away from the North and Europe towards China. At the center of this reconfiguration is the Chinese initiative called Belt and Road, also known as the OBOR, or the One Belt, One Road initiative. The Musina-Makhado Zone is a critical link in this large-scale reconfiguration of trade towards China, as it will tie South Africa into the expansion of the railroad and maritime route. And I will explain that a little bit more in detail in a couple of minutes. But just to explain that this is also why the zone was promoted so heavily on Cyril Ramaphosa's return from the FOCAC meeting in Beijing in 2018, when the zone was first announced as going ahead. In November 2020, the DTIC Deputy Minister Fikile Majola also stated that the primary objective of special economic zones is to create an industrial complex targeting investments and industries in the manufacturing sector and tradable services, and to develop infrastructure to support industrial activities. This can all be seen as a way of justifying the go-ahead of the Musina-Makhado Zone, particularly against the background of stalled infrastructural investment in South Africa as a result of COVID-19. How do special economic zones work? Why are they seen as a vehicle for successful economic development? Zones following the Chinese model are promoted as a way of attracting foreign direct investment through tax incentives. And the tax incentives that apply in South Africa as a result of the 2014 legislation bring South African zones into line with global FDI investment trends. The zones in South Africa were previously known as industrial development zones and did not come with tax incentives. They were geographically distinct investment havens, but unfortunately did not create a lot of production value chains because they did not attract a lot of foreign direct investment, or in fact any investment. The special economic zones, as they have been rebranded, have attracted much more foreign direct investment over the last 5 or so years, mostly because they are now able to offer the incentives such as, for example, 15% corporate tax as opposed to the 28% corporate tax outside the zones. Other incentives are PAYE and VAT concessions, customs and export concessions, and in some cases infrastructural support from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition for investment top structures. Companies also pay very much lower rates for water and electricity. So in the broader South African context, we have a number of zones, 11 to date, with more in the pipeline. And the success of SEZs as a vehicle for economic diversification has led to their proliferation throughout the Global South. A recent UNCTAD discussion paper in 2020 states that there are around 5,400 SEZs in the developing world, of which more than 1,000 have been established within the last 5 years. So it is against this background that we can see the justification for the Musina-Makhado Special Economic Zone, in that it is an example of both the ways in which zones can bring about technological sophistication and product diversification. We have two examples of so-called successful SEZs in South Africa, namely Kruger SEZ in the Eastern Cape, which specializes in 4th IR cargo freighting and automobiles, to name two, and Dubai Trade Port in KZN with high-tech manufacturing of TVs, cell phones, and also 4th IR freighting. And Musina-Makhado follows on the back of these two initiatives, also in promoting 4th IR through large-scale mineral beneficiation. So the development initiative centers on two major policy justifications. The first policy angle, endorsed by FOCAC, is that the zone will integrate South Africa economically into Southern Africa and the Global South through the Belt and Road Initiative, and it will create economic growth and job creation, not just nationally, but also regionally. The second angle is that it will boost infrastructure-led growth, and this will help to aid the ailing South African economy and bring about a move towards development that is orientated towards the much touted fourth industrial revolution. COVID adds to this justification in that Finance Minister Tito Mboweni recently announced that the economic reconstruction and recovery plan that was released mid-year this year stands in jeopardy as South Africa's debt to GDP ratio skyrockets from around 70% to between 80 and 90% of GDP by 2021, leaving us with literally nothing over for President Ramaphosa's much-touted infrastructural development growth initiative that has been mentioned over and over during 2019 and 2020. Part of the economic development envisaged by the zones generally, and particularly in the case of Musina-Makhado, is their selling point of job creation. The MMSEZ EIA promises to create up to 37,000 jobs for locals in Limpopo province. Worldwide, though, the zones are not favorable to locals, and China has a reputation for bringing in its own high-tech skills along with its foreign direct investment. Generally, in special economic zones, costs are cut through basic labor needs being cheaply met by the unskilled labor and semi-skilled labor found close to the zones. The zones following the Chinese model are not known to bring long-term employment, and labor is also controlled through labor pacts. These are present in all South African SEZs and will most likely form part of the Musina-Makhado zone as well. Returning to the question of how the zone fits into China's expansion of Belt and Road, it is important to note that many of China's Belt and Road projects throughout the developing South and in Africa have been critiqued for heightening the extraction of natural resources that raise carbon pollution levels. And the MMSEZ is a case in point. It will also be the first zone in South Africa to be operated by a foreign company, in this case the Chinese company known as Shenzhen Huimor. The company was already given its operator's license in 2017 by the then Minister of Trade and Industry, Rob Davies. The company has also committed to investing $3.8 billion in the operational success of the zone. This will mean an unprecedented level of foreign control. And in addition to this, most of the proposed industries are carbon-intensive, environmentally destructive, and a threat to the livelihoods of the communities in the medium term, as even the EIA confesses. So if we look at the list of industries that are proposed, and as most of you already know in some detail, so I'm not going to dwell on this, they are all carbon-intensive and environmentally harmful to both the ecology as well as to livelihoods of communities in the region. The justification then for the zone has to be seen against the growth promise that the zone is said to bring. The national government has bragged that the zone will attract 150 billion in FDI. This is over and above what Shenzhen Huimo has promised. And in March 2020, the Limpopo Premier Stanley Matabata announced that a further 36.3 billion had been invested in coal mining over the last year, which is obviously an anticipation of the SEZ being set up. Rob Tooley, the chairperson of the SEZ board, stated in March that the basic appeal of the zone is the underdevelopment of Africa, and as a fourth IR logistical hub, we will be a conduit to the development in SADC. So it is very clear that the justification for the zone is in terms of its growth boost to both South Africa and to the region. At this point, we're going to turn briefly to the public participation process around the environmental impact assessment to see just how this has fed into the justification for the zone. We all know that in terms of the EIA, the zone is seen to have the potential to mitigate each one of the dirty industries that have been listed as part of its metallurgical cluster. And the EIA assessment also papers over the endemic water scarcity issues by stating that if insufficient water is available in the catchment and the social and economic opportunities offered by the zone are sufficiently attractive, additional water may be brought in from neighbouring catchments. And we will discuss this a little bit more in depth at the end of the presentation. We know that it has led to the proposed zone has led to the burgeoning of coal mining, and that this will also add to the burden on water demand in the region over the next decade. The SEZ itself will use in excess of 80 million cubic litres of water per year. So how did this all get into the public domain? We know through organisations like EarthLife and the Centre for Environmental Rights that information on the zone has been hard to come by. We have all anticipated the EIA over the last year, although many of us wondered whether it would ever see the light of day. When it did, two things are striking about the public participation process. The first is the lack of local community information prior to the rolling out of the environmental impact assessment. And the second is the lack of inclusion of communities, especially rural communities, in the process, in a meaningful or indeed in any way, as many of them were excluded, including the Mudumeli community, which is one of the closest communities to the zone. As EarthLife often remind us, all large-scale development initiatives, especially those with huge community impacts, should abide by the principle endorsed by the United Nations Human Rights Council as to free, prior and informed consent, so that those communities affected by development projects or proposed development projects may engage from an informed base. In this understanding of engagement, meaningful participation is participation that can make a difference to the policy process outcomes. If not, it is not participation, but merely consultation or information sharing. The EIA process could thus be objected to as falling foul of both this international recognized development guideline as well as national public participation guidelines that were published by the Department of Environmental Affairs in 1998 that state that mechanisms may be used for engagement or even notification purposes that must suitably allow for the engagement of all interested and affected parties that may be illiterate or disabled or who may have any other disadvantage. Not only were communities not informed prior to the release of the EIA, but the process of public announcement of the participation process was clearly inadequate. The meetings that were held in September were announced 10 days before they were held, and they were advertised in exactly 2 newspapers. The meetings in most cases were rather poorly attended, and this was made even more pronounced by the fact that they took place during lockdown conditions, which meant that only 50 people were allowed to attend. As a result of criticism around the public participation process, another set of meetings were held in October. Again, these were announced but 1 week before they were held. Just after the September public participation process, SEZ researchers undertook a rapid appraisal vox pop in Louis Trichardt and in surrounding communities to establish how many communities knew about the zone and knew about the public participation process. As other environmental NGOs who've been involved, including EarthLife and Save Our Limpopo Valley Solve, will attest, most community leaders were vaguely aware of the zone and most were poorly informed. The general population had no knowledge of either the public participation process or, in fact, what the zone will entail for Limpopo province. In spite of this, what I would like to now turn to end the presentation is why the high-level environmental impact assessment may still get the go-ahead. Although many organizations, some of you listening in today included, may have lodged objections to the high-level EIA, there are, however, some serious concerns going forward about how the high-level EIA may still go through. It is particularly important to focus on why this EIA has been called a high-level one. A well-known governmental method is to break up EIA processes and thus to obtain initial consent for a less contentious dimension of the overall project. And in the case of the Musina-Makhado zone, this EIA is predominantly to initiate approval for the clearing of the site from leadette. The carbon-intensive aspects of the zone will all need separate EIAs, and each project will have to apply for a water use license. So this compartmentalizes and contains the overall environmental impact of the zone, and to object to each of the industries will require a considerable amount of time, energy, and money. So through a process of resource attrition and NGO mobilization fatigue, subsequent EIAs may be easier to push through. Well, this is government's thinking anyway. One positive outcome of the efforts of organizations like EarthLife, Solve, and the Center for Environmental Rights is that the window for public comment and critique on the environmental impact assessment has been extended into January 2021. To conclude, though, we revisit the question of whether the process of objecting to the current EIA is likely to stop the establishment of the zone. There are a few compelling reasons why this is unlikely. The first is that the zone is already legally designated. The second is that the operator Shenzhen Huimo already has an operator's license as of 2017. The third is that tenders for the zone have been put out by provincial government in 2020. And fourthly, the amount of FDI that the zone is attracting will be argued by government to be an essential part of boosting post-COVID growth and for spearing industrial development. China has evidently also contributed enormous amounts of investment aid, loans, and commitments to growth within the zone and to infrastructural development in accordance with its Belt and Road Initiative. So, government may well argue that the zone has added importance to the region's post-COVID development trajectory, together with the EIA arguments for environmental mitigation down the line for the various industries. This could land up validating the carbon-intensive, extractivist and exploitative dimensions, despite South Africa's inclusive development and just transition commitments. A final footnote: a very worrying aspect of Musina-Makhado is that there is very little information in the public domain about the investments made by the Chinese companies, by Shenzhen Huimor, and by the Chinese mining companies. We don't have to look far to see the negative consequences of infrastructure-led borrowing and loans that are packaged as gifts from China. Kenya's Mombasa port may well be ceded to China in repayment for the Nairobi-Mombasa railway line, which was constructed at enormous costs to the Kenyan fiscus. Similarly, in Africa, Djibouti and Ethiopia, just to name two, owe China approximately 70% of their debt, and both have debt to GDP ratios close to that of South Africa, which is above the danger threshold of 70%. The Sri Lankan port of Hambantota also stands as a case in point for what can happen if Chinese debt repayments are not met. Due to Sri Lanka defaulting on loans, the port has been ceded to China for a period of 99 years. So the history of Chinese mega project investments shows that public pressure for disclosure of the terms of Chinese investments and loans are critical. And currently in South Africa, we really do have a dearth of this information. There is thus a vital role for environmental NGOs and activists to play in ensuring that the South African government is not allowed to make the mistakes that other countries in Africa and the Global South have made, where non-disclosure of investment agreements and terms of loans have caused staggering levels of both indebtedness and environmental degradation.